So I'm Sean Levine. I'm in the Marriage and Family Therapy program at Texas A&M Central Texas. Yeah, let me read a quick quote from a book I really enjoy, part of our class, Systems Theory in Action by Shelley Smith Acuna, where she says, within systems theory, recent developments in using narratives to promote change are worth exploring in more depth. Although the two schools of thought, narrative therapy and solution-focused therapy, employ different techniques, they share a common emphasis on the power of language to shape our experience. So narrative therapy is the one that I've chosen to really focus on and to use extensively. The main idea is, as the text says, is to use language, in particular to use story, to really both get to know a person and also then to help them kind of reframe their life. We see the distress in a person's life within the context of the conflict between stories, overarching narratives that are then conflicting with their own personal story, and that's where the distress lives. And so the basic idea of narrative therapy is to use narrative to transform somebody's life. Yeah, I think one of the keys is this idea of using narrative. That's a major distinctive. Of course, it's in the title of the therapeutic approach. But the idea of approaching a person from their story, looking for conflict between their story and whatever dominant narratives are trying to kind of override their own personal narrative is a key distinctive. I think also the collaborative nature of this work. Of course, all therapy involves collaboration between the therapist and the client, but in this case, the therapist and the client collaborate to co-edit or co-author a person's personal narrative, their story. That's a distinctive of ours, that the therapist and the client work together, both to find, to locate, and then to change and transform narratives, and by doing that, to change a person's life. I think those would be kind of the distinctives, the nature of the collaborative work as a co-authoring. Narrative therapy, as a therapist, the key for narrative therapy is to be able to ask lots of very pointed and helpful questions. So in order to get to know a person's story, you're asking them about them. What I find really interesting about this approach is that we see the problem as the problem, not the people as the problem. So the idea is to ask questions of the person to find out details about their own personal narrative and the dominant narratives in their life that are creating conflict. The key intervention, I think, is as a therapist to be very aware and present and to ask lots of questions. The questions that really help to begin focusing the therapeutic process are questions about how the narratives in a person's life have impacted them, how those dominant narratives and even their own personal narrative have impacted them personally, but also how they have impacted the stories. In particular, there are times when one can find that a person has successfully navigated the dominant narratives to live an authentic story of their own. So we key in on those moments because those are opportunities to learn how that person can then do that more frequently and reduce the level of distress in their lives. So I would say the key process is questioning, all kinds of questions about the narratives, and those questions then do something very important in the therapeutic process, and that is to externalize a person's problems. A lot of times they're living in what we call a problem-saturated narrative, and so their whole life is wrapped around the problems that they're having. Their whole existence is centered on these problems, and all they can see is the problems, and they feel like the problems are a part of them, like they have the problem. And what asking questions of these narratives accomplishes is pulling the problem out of the person, so to speak, externalizing it, making it something that we both can look at and work with. And we use those externalizing processes to get at the narratives themselves and begin to transform them. So the transformation happens when, in therapy, we use the intervention of alternative narratives. We look for new stories, or we look for ways to expand the story that a person's trying to live so that it's no longer centered on quote unquote the problems, but on how they can live a more full and robust and authentic personal story, even in the context of all these dominant narratives that are a part of their lives. And so I guess I would say, in terms of intervention, it's a very present and aware therapist, and lots of questions about the stories that a person is trying to live his or her life in and from. To describe narrative therapy in one sentence would be: we live our lives and we heal our lives in stories. The key always in narrative therapy is to get at the stories and where they're at cross purposes. What I've seen a lot in my own work is that people are trying to fulfill expectations of a dominant narrative that just don't match their own personal life. They've outgrown those stories. We bring them from our early childhood, and part of growing up and becoming an authentic individual adult who can successfully navigate relationships is kind of coming out from the problematic areas of those dominant narratives and finding ways to express our own personal story in an authentic way. So we live our lives in stories. If you think about how you think about your everyday life, we're always kind of the lead character in a story that's going on in our hearts and in our minds. And so helping a person to find where that story is conflicting with others, and then pull away from that, fill out their own personal story, his or her own personal story, and live that more authentically, is kind of how life develops. And what happens a lot of times is people get stuck. They get stuck in trying to have their own personal story, and yet, whether it's from home, from work, from society, from all these different contexts, they're receiving signals about these other stories that they either should be living into or whatever, and so they feel badly about that. So the idea is that we live our lives and we heal our lives in stories. I love listening to people's stories. I found myself drawn to that, and that was a key component of my work with people. When I realized that could be a therapeutic intervention, it was a very exciting moment for me. And to read about, learn about, and begin to practice the idea that I could inhabit other people's stories and do that in a healing way was really, really exciting for me, and it has proven to be both effective and very satisfying for me as a therapist. And I've watched a lot of people walk away from my office living a new life because they've changed the language about their life. So I started doing this kind of work as soon as I realized that it could serve as a healing moment. I've watched couples in particular, as I've worked with families, couples and then their children, realize how each of them were holding on to these narratives that they had pulled from other contexts, and they were clashing within the context of the relationship, causing a lot of interpersonal distress. And so to help a family, it's amazing to watch a family realize where their narratives are conflicting, and then kind of put away old stories and start writing their own. Now this is our family story. And I've watched countless times where that has transformed people's lives and helped them to live a more satisfying family life. So not only is it personal stories, but also contextual stories, families who realize they can co-create a new way of living, a new language for their life. Very exciting.